Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another Faculty Friday. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies, and delighted to be today speaking with Professor Alvin Camba about China's Belt and Road Initiative and other timely issues related to China. Professor Camba is an assistant professor at the Korbel School and also a faculty affiliate of the C. Chow Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. Alvin is also a faculty affiliate at the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Stratbeiss Alberto del Rosario Institute in the Philippines and the Paramandina Public Policy Institute in Indonesia. Alvin's received lots of awards for his papers at the American Sociological Association. He's been funded by many foundations and research institutions. He does a lot of really policy-related work. I think he's actually in DC today doing some consulting with policymakers in DC. He's widely published on issues related to Chinese finance investment in Southeast Asia. And he's published in really top journals and presented at places like the World Bank, Aid Data, and the US State Department. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Alvin today to Faculty Friday. Welcome, Alvin.
Well, thank you, Fritz, for organizing this. I'm really happy to talk about my research.
Well, let's jump right in. As is usual here, Alvin and I'll talk for about 35, 40 minutes. And then we do want to get to your questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. Alvin, let's just start with the basics. We all know something of Belt and Road, everyone listening here probably, but what exactly is the Belt and Road Initiative, and why is it called the Belt and Road?
Sure. So officially, it is the Chinese state's global infrastructure initiative to invest $1 trillion in the Eurasian region's infrastructure, connectivity, and transportation projects. It has several pillars: government to government, business to business, people to people. The Belt and Road was called the One Belt, One Road before. It refers to the Silk Road, sort of the ancient trade routes between the East and the West back centuries ago. Originally, it was One Belt, One Road, but the Communist Party Central Compilation and Translation Bureau changed it to the Belt and Road Initiative to make it more palatable to English. It slides easier for the tongue. I want to make it clear, however, that the Belt and Road is simply a subset of a broader process of money coming out of China. The movement of money coming out of China has been there since the early 90s. Foreign direct investment, aid, development finance. More recently, there's been a lot of money laundered out of China, what I call illicit capital inflows that goes to offshore financial centers before they go to illicit sectors. So in a sense, the Belt and Road is hyped up, but at the same time, it's also super important because it is the attempt of the Chinese government to sort of centralize these existing processes and sort of redirect them towards more state-oriented goals.
So what kind of, Alvin, say a bit more about what kinds of things they're investing in. As I understand, you mentioned in passing the reference to the Silk Road when I was in Xi'an, I guess a couple of years ago. There was in the middle of a big Belt and Road conference, and there was a lot of reference to the Silk Road in a sense in which there was at least in the imagination of the Chinese kind of recreation of China at the center of a trading hub. But what exactly are they investing in?
So a lot of it goes to infrastructure. So I think about ports, for instance, that connects maritime routes all together. And there is, although there's another initiative, sort of the Maritime Initiative, which is sort of the counterpart of the Belt and Road, is sort of the maritime areas. There's also a lot of railway infrastructure, roads, bridges, projects on even manufacturing as well, like industrial parks. They're also investing in those places. They find it in Indonesia, Malaysia, and many other places, Ethiopia, Thailand. So infrastructure-related projects that increase connectivity and sort of transportation altogether. A lot of projects that developing countries in the global south actually want.
And so that's very helpful. And I recognize, as you point out, that this is only a piece of the total financial flows coming out of China, but just to stay focused on this for the moment, because it is state-sponsored investment. What lies behind this? What are the motives? What are the government's aspirations with respect to this initiative?
So scholars have pointed to three motivations here. There's economic, exporting overcapacity. So China is dealing with a lot of like overcapacity, meaning its economic activities have not generated sufficient market returns in terms of like the state-led investments that's happening within China. So they're trying to export the capacity outside. If they export the capacity, it continues the activities of firms, Chinese firms, to actually earn money at the same time to sort of continue its activities, continuing the employment of the population, particularly those employed in the firms. That's the first motivation. The second is influence, creating connectivity in Asia, making China sort of the central node for the emerging economies in the world. So most emerging economies are located in like Central and Southeast Asia and South Asia. There's also a motivation on a strategic geopolitical supposedly motivation. It moves China to the west instead of like going to sort of like the southeast, where you have sort of an American sort of influence, like in the Philippines and Korea and like Japan. So you have this like three motivations altogether. I would argue there are I would like to mention two articles here that are very helpful. One is by Professor Minya of Boston University. She has a Journal of 2019 Journal of Contemporary China publication. Another is by our very own Professor Zhao, where he has an article on the China's Belt and Road Initiative as a signature policy by Xi Jinping. It was also published in Journal of Contemporary China, and this is one of the most important journals in China studies. I think it's top 2. And the Corbell School, of course, is like the one that's like.
We're very proud of it here at the Corbell Schools. Yes, absolutely. Well, you alluded to in your answer the kind of internal politics of this within China. I mean, there's a tendency, I think, here in the U.S., probably elsewhere, to look at China and imagine China as some kind of unitary, rational, strategic actor. But of course, like any country, there's complicated internal politics. What are some of the driving forces internally within Chinese politics?
Now, what's interesting here is that there are actually many different agencies and actors driving the Belt and Road. I think one of the most central agencies is called the National Development and Reform Commission. It's supposedly the pilot agency that coordinates direct institutions and mechanisms when it comes to the Belt and Road. I mentioned Professor Minya from Boston University. She researched that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce actually have little power over the question of like Belt and Road projects and and how much money that comes in. And then this is where she talks about the role of like other ministries and agencies in China, such as the Ministry of Transportation, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, and SASEC as well, which is another the agency that coordinates the state-oriented enterprises. They actually had a bigger sort of like role in terms of like shaping, for instance, like Belt and Road projects and what kind of projects get funding, what kind of projects get pushed. So in a sense, like there are multiple actors coordinating within China. We also have to take into account provincial elites from the provinces, the ones in the ministries that I've mentioned, then local elites as well from cities. All of them have a hand in sort of like, forming Belt and Road projects and what gets pushed and what doesn't. There's a lot of internal competition that takes place there.
Yeah, and so that makes it's very helpful, and you really begin to get a sense of the richness of the Chinese political system, which is indeed complicated. I assume also, and I think you mentioned this as well in passing, there are a lot of private interests here as well. So the business interests, the construction, the finance, say a bit more about those and how they play out here.
So the biggest, in my analysis, and other people have argued the same thing, the biggest Chinese private firms are inherently much more tied to the state than sort of like the smaller ones. When I think about the smaller ones, those city level ones are sort of like the companies that are not as big. They have a lot of agency, and they don't often like get involved in is like major state initiatives.
Yeah.
But when you think about the biggest private businesses, they are inherently tied to the state. Of course, there's not a lot of them with the big businesses, but still they have a lot of money, they have a lot of capacity, they have a lot of power.
And you know, in the U.S., we would imagine that you know, the private sector in some sense has power over government. When you say, you know, they're connected to the state, which way does power flow? I mean, you see in China much, certainly with regard to at present, with regard to some of the high tech firms, you see the government pushing back at the power of the private sector. I don't know if there's something to be said there, but it's interesting to think about who is really in charge here.
In the Chinese case, increasingly in the past, like I would say 10 years since President Xi Jinping came in, the power of the state has definitely grown within China. The people in state-owned enterprises, for instance, they draw a lot from Communist Party CCP members, which the sort of the people who have like important positions in government, they also go to state enterprises. And then when the big private firms as well, they also absorb a lot of this like state actors, sort of this like Communist Party members and sort of like former state bureaucrats from the various ministries. So there's a lot of revolving door there. But yeah, in the Chinese context, power flows largely from the state, which comprises multiple competing actors at different levels, and then affects, for instance, the private sector. I think the good case here would be Jack Ma, I think last year, where I think he made a comment about like regulation in China, and then he sort of got in trouble, and nobody heard from him for I think 1 month before he said something.
Yeah. Oh, very helpful. Well, let me ask you. This event was billed as Belt and Road in the post-COVID era, and let's talk about the ways in which perhaps the logic, not just of Belt and Road, but of the overall strategy of China in terms of recognizing China's economic development has been very much tied to trade and to being at the heart of these global supply chains. And I guess the question is whether, you know, with COVID, with increased economic nationalism, with supply chain disruptions, whether whether the logic of this is somehow changed at this point.
Before I get to that question, I would like to explain sort of how the so-called Chinese state capitalism and how it works to some degree.
Yes.
Thank you, Fritz. So in some ways, China departs from sort of the developmental state model that is popular in East Asia, particularly Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, where you have a government agency that has coordination and sort of institutions to sort of like redirect capital towards strategic sectors. The main difference with China, for instance, and sort of the East Asian countries is that in the East Asian countries, in Japan, South Korea, it's a lateral relationship between the state and the private sector. Whereas in China, the way it happens is that it's largely done by the state's penetration in the productive sector. So this is what's called state capitalism by a lot of authors, a lot of scholars. However, in as much as there is state capitalism, people have also illustrated that Chinese state capitalism is decentralized. So it goes back to what we were talking about a while ago, the role of local bureaucrats, potential elites, party state authority. People have called this fragmented authoritarianism in the literature. Now, the Belt and Road projects have exhibited the fragmentation as well, where there's a patchwork of sort of like a patchwork of policies that sort of come together rather than a master plan that's executed by some sort of cabal of like Chinese elites. But it doesn't happen that way. It's more of like a patchwork of policies by competing local actors that sort of drives the projects to move forward. Now, in as much as that is the Belt and Road, the Belt and Road also has a centralizing tendency where actors the ministries that I mentioned a while ago, they were given more capacity to mobilize resources and capital to redirect it towards particular projects, because the Belt and Road inherently has that sort of like that tendency. And now what happens in the Belt and Road is that in as much as it is decentralized, there's an increasing centralization around it. So that is the logic of it right now. Now, you raise an important question about about COVID. And I would argue that the Belt and Road's logic, despite has not been altered despite COVID. In some ways, one can argue that China has sort of anticipated the problems generated by COVID. For instance, supply chain disruptions due to market actors shying away from, from these activities. The Belt and Road and sort of increasing the state's capacity in redirecting resources has shown that if the state can redirect resources towards supply chains, you can minimize disruption. But what's crucial is that this sort of approach, the sort of increasing the capacity of the Chinese state to sort of mobilize resources, it comes back to the rift between the U.S. and China. When they're because of like the trade war, the Chinese government has realized that relying on American high-tech imports and semiconductors from abroad can be hampered by geopolitics. So what has happened in the past 2 years since COVID is that they have redirected it toward, they have like increased the state's capacity towards in order to mobilize their own resources. And at the same time, despite COVID, Belt and Road projects in many parts of the world was not disrupted. So the pandemic last year, for instance, when it was happening, the only projects that were moving forward were the Chinese projects, like in the Philippines, the dam projects, the bridge projects, in Indonesia, the train projects. It did not stop. Partly because China needs to mobilize the economy. I do want to add one thing. The new thing perhaps that's happening in China is the so-called dual circulation strategy, which was announced last May. The idea is to decrease reliance on overseas markets and focus on domestic production, domestic consumption. And this is a response to sort of the lessening the reliance on the United States.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, so in a sense, then it's interesting. There's several things you said there. I mean, one, of course, China was in a better position to continue, to invest in the recent downturn. It certainly suffered a great deal less, and then it's very interesting to think about in some sense, the supply chain disruptions actually increase the logic of investment and shoring up supply chains. Well, let me turn from the question of what China is trying to do to the perspective of emerging economies, developing economies. So a lot of critics of the Belt and Road have worried that this might be some kind of a trap for development countries, that if they incur debt as part of the financing of these port projects or other infrastructure projects, that they somehow become more beholden to China. You've argued that this fear is a bit overstated. So why?
So the argument that's out there, it comes in two levels. One is to say that Chinese money has the logic of the debt trap. The logic in the argument is that China is deliberately lending money to plunge countries into debt. And when countries are unable to pay, China comes in to ask for geopolitical or territorial concessions. And more often than not, they talk about the context of Sri Lanka or the case of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Now, to be frank, there actually is no empirical support for the debt trap. The idea came from an Indian think tank analyst back, I think, in 2016 or 17, and suddenly it was taken in by some US think tanks, including I think some Harvard master students who sort of wrote about it, and suddenly it appeared in New York Times and Washington Post. But there have been multiple studies done on this. There's the Rhodium Group, which is a market research firm based in London, New York, and Shanghai. They found that after analyzing 70, 80 plus Belt and Road projects, there really is just one case for the debt trap. There's another by the Center for Global Development here in DC, and they found that most countries are actually, in 2018 at least, most countries were in low debt risk in the debt trap. And if they are in a risky position, that's not because of China, but because of their own domestic institutions that are already having problems. People have argued against this as well. There's Deborah Brottingham here in Johns Hopkins and Kevin Gallagher from Boston University. They've made studies as well on the debt trap, and conclusively, there is no empirical support for it. The other side of the argument that you made is simply that there's a geopolitical influence, there's a geopolitical return when it comes to Chinese money. Now, this is harder to go against in a way. So we cannot deny that when you get money, when a host country gets money from China, there is influence, there is something that China gets back. Now, I would argue, however, that host country elites and governments have the capacity to sort of like fight back and sort of maneuver themselves when these issues are happening. Sort of the return to China is not automatic. In other words, for instance, like China is the biggest coal investor in terms of coal-fired power plants in Indonesia and Vietnam. Yet Indonesia and Vietnam have a territorial dispute when it comes to, at least when in Vietnam in the South China Sea, in Indonesia in the Natuna Islands. And many other countries have also illustrated some degree of like pushing back against China, even when China lends them money.
So you would argue, you do argue that, of course, in this country, there's enormous concern about China's rise as an economic power, as military power, et cetera. But with regard to this particular issue, that there's a great deal less for the United States to fear in terms of China's growing influence in the various places in the world, in Asia, also Africa, somewhat in Latin America as well, where Chinese finance is flowing.
With your question about the American sort of the issue of like the concern. So when there are negative outcomes that occur in a host country, I'm making an argument that at times it is not the Chinese government driving it, it is the host country government. So for instance, in one of my studies published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I argued that the Chinese dam projects in the Philippines were driven by Philippine elites rather than China. For China, it was an opportunity to win allies in the Philippines, which was the Duterte government, and they went along with it. They were complicit to what was happening, and that's expected. But the people who were driving the negative environmental and social outcomes in the Philippines was basically the Philippine government itself. It wasn't like the Chinese government. Now, if the question is American influence, the expansion of China will reduce American influence in different parts of the world. I'm not sure this is a legitimate concern, because U.S. influence in the world is not entirely good. To me, what's crucial is the US and China could temper each other in order to allow states in the global south to pursue what is best for them. And there are I can point to two things that are sort of problematic when I think about American influence as sort of like the American institutions, right? So the so-called liberal international order, which was born out of the post-Bretton, the Bretton Woods back in like the 1940s. This was the environment that the United States like established. One of the key tenets of the liberal international order is respect for foreign firm investments. And when there are disputes between countries, an investment should be arbitrated by an investment arbitration court. This is one of the institutions that the United States has established. Since the 1980s or 1970s, the American firms are the #1 source of cases against global South countries, but in investment arbitration disputes. When there's a dispute, American firms sue global South countries. Now, that may not be entirely wrong when we think about private property rights, and it's very debatable. But when we think about what's good for the global South, it's sort of difficult to sort of like think about development when the firms that are trying to invest are suing you in court to get something in return. The other example that I want to point to is infrastructure. So since the 90s, there's been a shift from infrastructure financing to something else, social, improving governance and sort of bureaucratic training. This has been the source of like World Bank funding. There's still infrastructure funding coming from the West, but the infrastructure funding has to follow the principle of bankability, meaning there has to be sufficient returns for the private sector before the private sector actually comes in with public money to invest in projects. Now, I'm not saying bankability is a bad thing, but what I'm saying is that there are particular instances when infrastructure projects are necessary for the development in global South, but the West does not provide that opportunity. So this is where the Chinese actually comes in to sort of like fill in the gap that was left by the West.
Well, thank you for that. It's a very helpful perspective that I think we probably doesn't sort of find its way into at least the popular news coverage of these issues. So thank you so much for that. Let me shift gears a little bit. We are, I guess, the last day of the COP in Glasgow. And so climate change is very much on people's minds. And I know you know a great deal about that as well. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions there. So, the first one, I guess, is really about the trajectory of China's policy and its promises. stated to peak, I guess, its carbon emissions by 2030, to be carbon neutral by 2060. I guess there were no further commitments made by China in Glasgow, which was commented on. But let's just sticking with those. There's a lot of skepticism out there about whether China can meet those targets, particularly at the same time that it seeks to maintain its aggressive economic growth goals. What's your take on that? What would you expect to see China being able to do over these in terms of meeting those goals?
So there's research here by Kelly Gallagher and the Climate Policy Lab on whether or not China can actually pursue those goals. And what they found is that in multiple scenarios, if China follows the policies and implement their policies judiciously, it is possible to meet those goals even before 2030. Now, the interviews themselves with policymakers in China revealed skepticism on whether that's possible because there's politics and in many occasions, even in China, implementation can be a problem. Yeah. Nonetheless, when we think about the way the Chinese economy has actually moved forward in the past like 5 to 10 years, it has made a lot of advances. So, for instance, they've banned coal-fired power plant financing within China, and as a result, those companies move out and invested somewhere else. But the renewable energy industry in China has actually surged. When you think about solar, electric vehicle, the electric vehicle sector, I think there are 385 electric vehicle companies in China. 80 of those have already produced their own cars that uses like EV batteries. And the economy itself is, and sort of the renewable energy companies are also taking off. For instance, they've exported hydropower technology to Laos, and Laos has become the sort of the energy source of like mainland Southeast Asia through the hydropower power plants established by China in Laos. Not to say hydropower is good; it creates a lot of methane that can be bad for the environment as well. China has also begun exporting a lot of like solar panels to other countries that are very affordable and cheap. For instance, my dad's house in Manila, well, not in Manila, but in the Philippines, it's now 100% solar. And he was telling me he basically imported the technology from China.
Well, that's true. China is certainly moving very fast and in the green energy space, and an issue for U.S. businesses certainly, and a matter of some competitive stress, I think, for American firms in that space. But isn't it also the case that China continues to build coal-fired plants? And so, again, critics of China point to that. I think it may be the case that at the same time they're retiring them. But could you say more about that? I know that's an issue that comes up often, which is, yes, China says it can do these things. Yes, of course, they're building solar power panels at a prodigious rate, et cetera. But look, they're still starting new coal-fired plants.
So this is really interesting because there was an announcement, I think, around like 2 or 3 weeks ago by President Xi Jinping, I think in a UN context, that China will stop publicly financing coal-fired power plants. And in many ways, it sort of in many ways it has affected host countries in a way that it has made host countries go back to the drawing board in order to sort of like think about what is their energy development strategy, because the announcement is relatively unclear. So they announced they're going to stop financing new CFPs, new coal-fired power plants. It's unclear whether that affects existing power plants that they're building, but a lot of the I think 90% of the committed the plans to sort of build new coal-fired power plants in Africa have already been canceled from China. And then there was another case in Bangladesh where I think the Bangladesh government was trying to get the Chinese government to fund this like coal-fired power plant. Yet the Chinese, after the Xi Jinping's announcement, the Chinese embassy sent a letter back to Bangladesh, the Bangladesh government, telling them, "Oh, we cannot fund this anymore." So there is a move by the Chinese government to sort of limit the financing of coal-fired power plants. It's a move putting China closer to Korea and Japan, who have made similar moves in the past like 5 years. At the same time, when we think about the motivation for this, people have why did they do this? Some people said it's because it's about to make their renewable energy companies more competitive, especially when if CFPs are no longer viable, who takes over after which companies? The other thing is that it also increases Chinese soft power as to illustrate their commitment to sort of like to reducing carbon emissions. So this is super interesting because it's the last day of it's the last day of the Glasgow conference, and then Indonesia and Vietnam, which are the receivers of the two of the largest receivers of like Chinese investments in coal-fired power plants, have actually joined the pledge. And part of it is the result. The part of it is a result of China's new refusal to fund CFPs moving forward.
So it's very interesting. Now within China, though, my understanding is though that there are still plants being built within China. I don't know who's financing them or what the driving forces are. Is that the case?
I mean, there are some smaller ones, but I think it's really decreased in the past like 10 years. So I think it's more like if there's existing capacity, they let it be, and then if there's some repairs to the capacity, it happens. But there are no more new coal-fired power plants, as far as I know. It's the official policy has been to not allow CFPs to sort of expand. There's been very limited state support for them, if none. And it hasn't. I don't think that's been the case, at least in the past 10 years.
Oh, all right, very helpful. Well, speaking of the COP in Glasgow, a bit of a surprise. It was an announcement that China and the U.S. agreed to accelerate their cooperation for the first time. I think mentioning methane on reducing methane, which is we all know is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. Low on specifics, but at least a apparent area in which the U.S. and China may be able to cooperate. What do you make of it? Is this a significant agreement? Is it just more talk than action?
I think it is somewhere in between. I feel like it is a commitment from both countries. At the same time, commitment does not always lead to specific policy outcomes. It's important to I think alongside the pledge of about coal there was a pledge of 20 countries. They've signed a statement on ending public financing for fossil fuels, including gas. And the signatories actually included the United States and Canada. So if not coal, gas is the other alternative. But if the US and Canada would limit the financing on gas, then that would actually limit making gas an alternative moving forward. I do know that here in the US, there is a lot of traction. Actually, in the meetings a while ago, it was like people were talking about it. There's a lot of traction right now for electric vehicle production, and the new infrastructure bill that was finally signed. It is a sign of things moving forward for the United States in terms of electric vehicles, particularly, and sort of more renewable energy as well. But in China, it has been the case. Electric vehicles and the renewable industries are some of their more competitive sectors.
Yeah, one of the big issues I think probably unresolved in Glasgow really revolves around climate debt and questions of what obligations the United States in particular and other developed countries should have because of our cumulative impact to developing emerging economies who are often the most vulnerable and have contributed the least to the climate problem. Of course, this is a very difficult issue because politically it has been proven difficult to get real funding available to help with adaptation in developing countries. China's in an interesting space. I mean, it was a later mover, but it now is the second largest cumulative contributor to the climate problem. I'm curious what its position is and whether there's any more appetite in China to address the concerns raised by poor developing countries who are, of course, been clamoring, pretty vocally, I think, in Glasgow for attention on this issue.
So, so China's move to sort of end coal financing is partly a result of this clamor from the global south to sort of like finally limit the expansion of new coal-fired power plants. So this this was exactly what Xi Jinping's speech was like targeting. It was to sort of like address the concerns of actors in the global south, including civil society and the domestic, and I would say some domestic like actors in the global south. Of course, some host country elites were unhappy about the decision because they're trying to like fund new power plants. Nonetheless, there's an economic logic as well for the Chinese. When I think about their new industries when it comes to renewables and electric vehicle batteries, it really opens up the space for them.
Yeah. Well, let me shift gears one more time into questions of security, because the other high-profile conversation taking place in this country, at least, is whether somehow or another conflict with China, between China and the U.S. is somehow inevitable, and real concern about what's happening with respect to Taiwan and the South China Sea. You made reference to that earlier. Let me start with that first, and then we'll come to maybe the larger question. There's been, of course, a lot of saber rattling, a lot of rhetoric from Chinese leadership about Taiwan, the building of artificial islands in the South China Sea, and claims about their rights to territory there. How do you read this? I mean, how worried should, in particular, other countries and Taiwan in Asia be concerned about China's military ambitions?
It is very worrying, particularly in Southeast Asia, in countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam. China's activities has been quite worrying. Let me just contextualize that in the South China Sea, there are like hundreds of islands in that, if not islands, small littoral areas. Yeah. And then multiple countries have sort of occupied these areas, and they built their small naval and military sort of like infrastructure. Vietnam did it, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and of course China. Now, what China is doing, at least in the Philippine case, that is worrying, and even in Vietnam as well, is that a country is allowed a country is allowed to conduct economic activities in the exclusive economic zone, which is, I think, 10 nautical miles, if I'm not mistaken, from sort of like the official territory. And the exclusive economic zone, an EEZ, a country should be given the right to extract oil, for instance, or explore if there is oil or not. Now, what China is doing is that if a country does that, just such as the Philippines back in 2012, they took it as a sign of the Philippines actually is trying to claim this area. Yeah. And so what the Chinese has been doing is or at least the Chinese militia, they've been sending ships to sort of like actively fish in the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines and like Vietnam. And then what happened in 2012 was when the Philippines responded by sending a ship, the Chinese said, oh, it's a military like response to our fishing vessels. So the Chinese sent even more ships to that area. And then there was this area called the Scarborough. There's this area called the Scarborough Shoal, which is like some sort, it's not an island, it's a shoal. The Chinese ended up like taking it and sort of like militarizing it, terraforming it. Now, the Philippines does not have access to it anymore. And Filipino fishermen are unable to go there to fish. And there was a similar case there was a similar incident that happened last year in the Weston Reef, where Chinese ships basically surrounded the area, fishing ships, trying to basically ship, they're fishing in the Philippine EEZ, in the Philippine areas. And then the Philippines was tempted to sort of send a naval response. But if they do that, they worry that, the Chinese might actually do the same thing, where they send even more ships, and then they end up taking like that area. So there's a creeping expansion in the South China Sea of Chinese influence. Taiwan is another case. There is research by Oriana Mastro from like Stanford University, and I know there's a debate here. She argues that in the Taiwan case, China is finally might take military action in the future, partly because of China's own increasing military capacity and the belief within China that if China does something to Taiwan, the US is not going to respond sufficiently. The other issue is that if you look at the surveys in Taiwan, sort of the survey of whether or not Taiwanese are willing to sort of like reunite, whether Taiwanese will support reunification with Beijing, the younger generation in Taiwan has actually said no and has rejected that in the past like 10 years. So there is a worrying trend within China that as if you let Taiwan be, the new generation is not going to accept this anymore. And that is actually true. A lot of the KMT supporters, so KMT is the party that wants to reunify with China, or at least is open to like working with the CCP. A lot of the KMT are like the older people, and most of their support are like people in like their 30s above, but most people in the younger generation, they want to maintain what they have right now, which is a status quo, or pursue independence. So if it is safe. Now, I want to go back to the final thing, which is in both cases, the question of whether the US will come in to sort of defend a particular area comes in. I'm of the belief that I think when it comes to Taiwan, the US will do something. But when it comes to like the South China Sea, sort of those like little areas, those shoals and those rocks, it's hard to say. Probably not.
Yeah. Well, as you said, it's kind of a creeping, slow phenomenon. There's never a point of sufficient crisis, perhaps, to catalyze U.S. intervention. Well, last question. I do want to let people know, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to your questions. This really does go to the U.S.-China rivalry, and there's a lot of conversation now, and certainly in sort of IR journals and international relations journals, about whether some kind of conflict with China is more or less inevitable. Mearsheimer predictably had an article not long ago, he says in Foreign Affairs maybe, saying that this is going to happen because this happens when there's no longer a hegemon in the world, a single power. China is a rising power. The U.S. is a declining power. This is sometimes known as the Thucydides trap, and that therefore, there's a high probability of conflict. A recent article by Brands and Beckley in Foreign Policy, I think, argued that conflict is also likely, but they argue because quite the opposite, China is a declining power. And so under those circumstances, it makes sense for China to be more aggressive. Both of those lines of thought certainly depart from the perhaps overly optimistic views of the neoliberal dominant paradigm which led to a great extent to China joining the WTO and integration of China into the economic system on the theory, at least, that greater economic interdependence would reduce the probabilities of conflict. Well, a lot of competing theories out here, a lot of conversation, a lot of anxiety about where we're headed. I'm just curious, what's your perspective on this debate?
Right. I read both articles with interest. My take is that I think both takes are too macro structural. And I think they do make valid points. It's interesting. There is they don't disagree on conflict. What they disagree would be the nature of Chinese power and the degree of it. Yes. For Mearsheimer, it was an inevitable increase of inevitable rise of China. For Brands and Beckley, it was because China hit a glass ceiling, and because of the glass ceiling, China is now acting out, and that's their analysis. And to me, I think both issues are a bit too macro structural. I feel like a lot of the variables or factors that will determine US-China relations would be at the meso and the micro level. When we think about this multiple other issues, such as the South China Sea, Taiwan, CFP financing, Chinese investments in many parts of the world, disagreement on intellectual property rights, trade wars, for instance, and disagreements on, let's say, Afghanistan or like Syria. I think issues are going to like drive sort of the structure rather than the other way around. Because I think that I did not when I read Mersheimer's article, it was interesting how he was sort of like he basically argued that it was a mistake for the United States to sort of like to sort of aid Chinese economic growth. He said that the US should have anticipated this by like not helping China, by containing it back in the 80s. And then I thought he conveniently number one, hindsight is 20/20. But number two, I think he conveniently omitted the fact that the US was economically declining in the 80s and the 90s as well. And people have argued that through China, the US was able to stave off its decline because it found US firms were able to find a new source of labor, a new source of like cheap resources that sort of galvanized the global economy in the 90s. The United States was very much dependent on Chinese cheap exports. At the same time, that China was the biggest buyer of American treasury bonds. And all of this actually helped the United States sort of like keep its like dominance in the world, including the dominance of the American dollar. I mean, the biggest treasury bond holder in the world is like the Chinese. Yeah. So one can argue that they're inherently tied together. And if the US did not help China in the 90s, one can argue that the US might have declined anyway.
Yeah, I like that answer. I mean, the both of those arguments are pretty, as you point out, quite reductionist, and it's I think the way that you have of characterizing this gives a lot more. There's a lot less inevitability, I guess, about the outcome in that. I don't know if it's possible, but are there things in particular you would point to that are likely to be the most important factors as to whether or not there is ultimately conflict between the U.S. and China?
I really think it goes to East and Southeast Asia. China has said that there are two things that are irreconcilable when it comes to foreign policy: Taiwan and the South China Sea. Of course, there are multiple disagreements as well when it comes to the Uyghur issue in Xinjiang and sort of Hong Kong. But when it comes to these areas that China sees to be its historical domain, then this is where the problem is going to be. And of course, the United States has had a long presence in like East and Southeast Asia since like the 1900s.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Let me turn now to the Q&A. We have a couple of questions here that I'll get to, and please, if there are other questions, put them in. Sid Brooks asks, given your description and the reality of China's slow but aggressive military and economic steps in the South China Sea, shouldn't countries, Vietnam, Philippines, Australia, et cetera, in the area be very apprehensive about China's intentions and goodwill? You partially answered that, but maybe you could elaborate.
Yeah, the countries are very apprehensive about it. The problem is like there's a limited response when it comes to the Southeast Asia and sort of Australia. And Australia is a different thing, but Southeast Asia, a response should be done through the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, the regional bloc in the area. The problem with ASEAN is that it operates following the principle of non-interference, and at the same time, the principle of consensus. So if the ASEAN countries don't have a consensus, they will not move towards a particular issue. Now, Cambodia, and more recently the Philippines, but at least temporarily the Philippines, but Cambodia has been a long friend of China. And since like when the Philippines won the Hague arbitration case in 2014, certifying that China is doing something wrong in sort of the EEZ of the Philippines, Cambodia has actually has voted against uniting against China, and people have said that it goes back to the relationship of China and Cambodia. So there is there's a lack of unity when it comes to Southeast Asia, and most countries were apathetic about it, at least in 2014. Now there is some worrying trends about the expansion of China in the South China Sea, but countries also differ on that. Like for Indonesia, even though they disagree with China on the Natuna Islands, they think that, well, the Philippine EEZ is farther away anyway. Let the Philippines handle it first. For the Philippines, some of the elites are willing to sell out, not sell directly, but sort of like let China be in exchange. They will get Chinese money when it comes to opportunities for development finance. So there is a lack of unity when it comes to Southeast Asia. Now, Australia is another thing. I think Australia and China has had not good relations in the past, I think 5 years when it comes to Huawei, when it comes to coal. In some people have argued that Australia is being isolated right now in that region. But recently there was a US-Australia pact that sort of expanded like Australia's like I think nuclear capabilities, if I'm not mistaken. And the French were not happy about it. So countries are doing something to push back. They're not just united.
So interesting. So while they may share similar anxieties, all these various countries are in such different positions right now. It's hard to imagine Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Japan, Australia, sort of coalition containing China in some form.
Right now it is, and it has been difficult in the past 10 years. But moving forward, I think this is going to be like what you said, Fritz, a while ago. If there's going to be some sort of salient issue that's gonna emerge, it's gonna be this issue. So I think a coalition, if China becomes more aggressive and if China takes more action, a coalition is definitely possible.
Right, right. We have a question from our colleague Rachel Epstein, which really goes to a question about the state of China's economy regarding the Chinese property developer Evergrand. Are that firm's financial problems isolated or representative over leveraging in the Chinese economy more broadly? In addition, how has Evergrand managed to make its recent payments? Is the Chinese government helping behind the scenes?
Well, thank you, Rachel, for that question. So the Evergrand problem goes back to the way the Chinese economy works, which is I think big companies, big commercial firms, state-oriented enterprises and private companies themselves have access to state loans. And those loans, whether or not they're paid back, is less of an issue. What's important for the Chinese government is that it generates economic activities to sort of like stimulate economic growth and employ the population. And what often happens is that if the companies in China, private and state, cannot pay back the Chinese banks for economic activities, the Chinese state simply pushes the loan deadline like 50 years, 100 years later. There was a book that came out on this called Red Capitalism, I think in 2004. Now the Evergrand, Evergrand groups is sort of like in a broader sense, it's sort of dealing with the same issue. When it comes to the payments, I'm a bit unsure about it. I need to sort of read about it more to sort of like what's happening more with it directly. But when I read the issue, I'm like, oh, this is basically a classic problem in sort of in the Chinese context, which is like particular firms are given like endowments, and when something happens, it generates crisis.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I don't know very much about this, but it does seem that there's something equivalent of a real estate bubble in China, right? That because of the very high savings rate, the need to invest in something, you have this sort of distortion in the Chinese economy, which I guess is underlying the Evergrande problem. I don't know if you have any sense of how destabilizing that might be. For a long time, I think in recent history, we just imagined Chinese economy growing without problem. But is this the beginning of something of a kind of a serious structural issue that could, at minimum, reduce or slow the pace of Chinese economic growth?
Yeah, so people have been debating this since the early 2000s. So the Evergrande issue is linked to shadow banking and informal lenders, and is supposedly linked to the Chinese financial system as well. And there was a government crackdown recently. Now, the question to me of whether or not it will lead to something, it's really, really hard to say. This difference between consumption and investment in China has been there since like the early 2000s.
Yeah.
There was a book by Michael Pettis called The Great Rebalancing. He's an American economist working in Beijing. He got tenure in Beijing, but he's probably one of the most the best people like sort of like writing on this. The difference between investment and consumption rate in China is huge. Investment is way more, partly because of like state investments, state lending to companies. When it comes to savings and consumption, it's quite low in the Chinese context. So what the Chinese government has sought to do is sort of to rebalance that, to sort of like move towards to rebalance consumption and investment altogether. And the dual circulation strategy of decreasing overseas reliance and sort of increasing domestic activities is part of this. Now, it's really hard to say, Fritz, whether or not it's going to lead to something, a ticking time bomb. If I could answer that, I'd be rich by now, and probably won't be an academic.
Let me take another question here. Our colleague Ajay Clemens asks that there's a longstanding assumption that the more intertwined economies are, the less likely they are to go to war because the costs are so high. It seems clear that U.S. corporations' pursuit of Chinese companies and lower production costs have led those firms to make enormous concessions to China. How much leverage does China have over the U.S., and what are some of the implications for American allies in the East and Southeast?
Well, thank you, Aj, for that question, and thank you for being here. I did not tell them to come here, Fritz. So there is a lot of interdependence back in the 90s to the early 2000s. American firms were basically one of the largest investors in China. A lot of the experts of the Chinese partly come from US firms who invested in China. Now, when the products actually get to the United States, they are targeted towards American consumers. Now, there's been a lot of around 2010 up until 2015, there were issues about intellectual property disputes in the Chinese context. And American firms realized that it's actually getting more and more difficult to sort of do business in China. And as a result, there is some degree of firms moving out of China, including Western firms, because of the creeping government power. So the degree of that is debatable. Some people say there is not a lot of movement. Some people say there is. So I do think that interdependence between the US and China in the past 5 years has been decreasing. And this indicates a potential salient point, a potential flashpoint as to what Fritz said about a potential issue in the South China Sea. The Chinese SOEs, Chinese state companies and private firms have gained enormous power in the past, I think 10, 15 years, which was not the case before in the 90s. In the 90s, it was American firms, Western firms, and East Asian firms invested a lot in China, and that was a good thing for everybody because they access cheap labor and cheap resources. And for the Chinese government in general, its economic activities, right now there's more of a rift between I would say US firms and the Chinese government.
All right, great. Let me get to a couple more if we can here. So Asma Khalifi asks, how would Professor Camba explain China's shift to wolf warrior diplomacy and assuming a more active role in the international arena in relations to its historically its non-interventionist doctrine?
So, well, she's one of my students. Thank you for being here. So that shift occurred before COVID, but it became more salient during COVID. Do note, and the wolf warrior diplomacy really comes out when the West tries to lecture China, and suddenly when China now comes out to sort of say something against the West, particularly against the United States, against Pompeo, against the death trap diplomacy, or against anything that the US accuses China of. Now, it should be clear that the way the Chinese government has always pushed back on American sort of American accusations since the 90s, except that it was mainly towards a domestic audience. Wolf warrior diplomacy is geared towards an international audience, where you do, I mean, it's a bit of both, domestic and international, but the fact that internationally it is covered now, it is an illustration of, China's strength, that, we're not going to be bullied and we're going to push back. I would argue it doesn't really say anything about non-interference, because usually China only does this to Western countries, and usually they would say Western countries are being hypocritical, which in many cases that is true. So yeah.
Well, one last question. I'm afraid that's all the time we'll have, and you may have to be even brief there. But Christy Disney Bruckner asks, she's curious about take on disputes brought by China and by India with China as a third party related to domestic content requirements imposed by U.S. states in the renewable energy sector. And do you think China may drop its complaint given new commitments to act on climate? Or will these disputes just be stalled for several more years until the WTO can reestablish the appellate body? More generally, I guess, where do you see this going?
Oh, it's really hard to say. So usually there are disputes like this when it comes to domestic content property. It doesn't need to be on EV vehicles. It can be on, they've had disputes in the 90s and, well, not the 90s, like the 2000s when China joined. And then what usually happens is that the disputes take a couple of years before they're resolved. So I think that may be the trend of this new issue that sort of emerged. It may take a couple of years. It may just sit there. China has gained increasing influence in the WTO and many other international organizations. So I wouldn't be surprised if they sort of leverage that position. So that's my take, but I could be wrong. Who knows? The infrastructure deal and other things might lead to other outcomes.
Well, Alvin, as I'm sure everyone can observe, I could probably pretty much ask you anything on any topic related to this, and you would have something to say about it. But thank you so much for sharing your insights on all of these issues today. It's a real pleasure talking to you. Let me thank all of you in the audience for being with us on this Faculty Friday. Again, thank you, Alvin, and goodbye to all of you.
Thank you, Fritz. Take care.